Good afternoon and welcome to Tampa's Market Minute. I am Eric Odom, Principal Commercial Real Estate Broker for Net Lease Commercial Advisory in Tampa, Florida. And today we have with us Fernando Perez. Fernando is actually was with us, it's probably been 2 years now, I guess we talked about.
Yep.
And Fernando is an immigration attorney here in Tampa. He's been on Fox News and Univision talking about immigration issues. He has recently, I guess, been considered the top immigration attorney from Tampa Bay Magazine, and also top 5% of Florida attorneys by Florida Super Lawyer. That's what I understand, right? That's been recent.
Mm-hmm.
Recent. So thanks so much for joining us again today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Fernando has one of the most popular blog items that we've had in terms of hits and volume. And so we wanted to come back and follow up a little bit focus on one particular issue in regards to the E2 visa in regards to buying a restaurant. So again, welcome. And why don't we start off first by just giving a brief recap. We went in pretty deep last time on the E2 visa. So why don't you just give a real brief summary of what the E2 visa is, and then we'll go from there in terms of the restaurant.
Sure. The E2 visa is also called the Treaty Investor Visa. And it is a category of visa that is available to nationals of certain countries, not every country, certain countries with which the United States has a qualifying treaty. And for those countries, nationals of those countries who make an investment in the United States that is able to generate enough money for that investor and their family to live in the United States, as a result of that investment, that foreign national can come to the United States and live here really indefinitely.
And is there a minimum amount essentially that they're having to put in to be able to get that E2 visa?
Well, and that's one of the big myths about the E2 category, and the information that's on the internet actually doesn't help, because there are a lot of attorneys when you look at their websites and things like that tells you that it requires a $250,000 investment, or it requires a $100,000 investment. The fact is, there's no minimum amount. I've done them for as little as $7,000. Now, there's other things that are going to be involved to make a $7,000 investment work, but the key point here is that there is no minimum amount that a foreign national needs to invest. I also want to interject that this should not be confused with the EB-5 category, which requires a $1 million investment. That one does have a specific investment threshold. We've talked about that one before. That's a whole different animal.
I think that's where people get confused.
They do.
They get the 500,000, a million.
Exactly.
What does all this mean?
The E2, no minimum.
E2, no minimum. Since we had the original interview, there's been a lot of follow-up questions, and I think most of them, from me personally, have been in regards to convenience stores, gas stations, and restaurants. So why don't we focus a little bit on restaurants and go through a step-by-step of how,
Sure.
Okay, let's say you're an Italian and you want to open an Italian restaurant here in Tampa, Florida. How would you go about doing that?
Well, the first thing you would consider is, am I going to start one from scratch? In other words, am I going to go and lease space and buy the equipment, or am I going to buy an existing restaurant, which is maybe already Italian, or I'm going to change the name? And the reason that's important in the E2 context is because one of the things that you have to do is, even though there is no minimum investment amount, the immigration office here in the United States or the U.S. consulate needs to be convinced that whatever amount you've invested, whether it's $7,000 or $700,000, is the amount that is required to make that business viable. And the reason that's important is, if you buy an existing restaurant, which you're buying at fair market value prices, the government is not going to question whether you invested the correct amount, because obviously whoever you bought it from is selling it for the maximum amount they could get.
Sure.
On the other hand, if you're starting from nothing, then you could have a situation where the government comes back to you and says, okay, prove to us that the $50,000 you put into the space is enough to really make this a viable business.
Gotcha. Okay. So it almost sounds like it's a better option to consider buying an existing business. Is that the fact?
Generally, that's what I recommend to clients. Now, obviously, if you're investing $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 to develop something from the ground up, they're not going to question that. But most people aren't doing that. Most people, their investments might be substantially less than that. And I always tell clients, we can do it either way. but it's just going to be a lot tighter from the standpoint of getting an approval if you're buying something that you're buying on the open market.
What about franchises?
Franchises are great. The reason franchises are great is because one of the things that's very key, and we'll talk about this probably later, but one of the things that's key to the whole E2 category is the ability to show that whatever your investment is going to have the ability within 5 years to generate more than a minimal living income. The nice thing about franchises is that they have all of the documentation, they've done all the feasibility studies, they really do most of the work in connection with that 5-year forecast that you're going to prepare when you submit your application, showing that yes, because obviously if this franchise information showed that this thing was never going to make money, you'd never buy it. So franchises are great. Love them.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about you're buying an existing business, and what about owner financing? How would that fit in? Because frequently the issue is how are you going to it might be $500,000 to buy this business and have this restaurant, and how do you do that?
Well, there's a couple of ways, and one of the things that's unique to the E2 category, because the E2 category is premised on an investment. As a result, the regulations limit the amount that can be financed. And the limitations are a little stricter than what you would normally find in the open market. So like a 20% down, 80% financing, from an E2 standpoint, probably wouldn't work. But you have to understand what the limitations actually apply to. And the limitations on financing only apply to loans that are secured by the investment itself. Okay? So let's look at that restaurant example. And let's say that it's a $300,000 restaurant. I only want to put $100,000 down. I want to finance the other two. Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that. If the owner finances that $200,000 and it is an unsecured loan, that's going to be classified as cash. That's going to be okay. If you, and this is something that comes up a lot with a lot of my clients, is they've been coming here to the United States.
But let's realistically, you're not going to really find owners to do that.
No, but I'm going to get to that. So there's other options. So a lot of my clients have been coming to the United States as visitors for years. And let's say they own a condominium or a home and it's worth $300,000 or $400,000 and they've paid cash for that. Or maybe there's a $200,000 equity on it. Well, you can finance the investment and secure that $200,000 loan with your home.
Gotcha.
And that's okay because you're not securing it with the investment. That's also treated like cash.
Gotcha.
If you borrow the money back home so that it's secured by your assets back in the UK or wherever you're from, or in this case in Italy, again, that's going to be treated like cash here. So there are methods that you can try and use to be able to structure that financing. Another thing that we've done sometimes is, and the business would have to be feasible for this, is we split the transaction. And if the person, for example, is buying a business that includes real estate, we separate the real estate purchase from the purchase of the restaurant management business as a going concern. And then if we do that, because in most of the money is in the equipment and the real estate and all of that, we put the bulk of the financing there, and then we can pay that $100,000 as a all cash purchase to buy this restaurant management business. And then the restaurant management business, not a holding company, the restaurant management business then basically rents the space from your other company.
Gotcha.
And that works.
Okay. Oh, that's
so there's a lot of things that we can do. We can get creative with that.
And we talked about the difference between convenience store and restaurant, and you said to me, well, really from an E2 standpoint, restaurant is a better selection. And why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's the benefit of a restaurant over a convenience store is that, in my experience, convenience stores have very few employees. Restaurants, and obviously that depends on a lot of things, but restaurants will usually have more employees. The potential benefit, because it's not an absolute benefit, but the potential benefit is the key to the E2. Like I said before, the amount you invest doesn't matter, as long as you can show that the investment within 5 years is going to generate more money than what the investor needs to live on. So that's sort of the first threshold. And the term that the government uses for that is marginality. A business that doesn't have the ability within 5 years to generate that kind of income is deemed marginal and doesn't qualify for the E2. So what the regulations say is if a business can't generate that kind of income within 5 years, but it has employees, then you can say, okay, maybe I'm not putting as much money in my pocket as I'd like to, but I'm creating jobs for 6 U.S. workers.
Gotcha.
And I say 6 just to pick a number. There's no magic number in the regulations. Then if the business is still in the process of developing to the point where it's generating the kind of income you want, during those years, you can rely on the fact that you're creating jobs as a way of keeping those extensions going until you've really gotten the business developed. And that's something that nowadays might be more crucial because given the economy the way it is, it might take a little bit longer.
How about family members? How do you compensate family members, and who can you compensate? I mean, can you bring your second and third cousin over with you off this E2 visa, or it's just the immediate family that's able to come on that visa and work inside of that restaurant?
Well, at the base level, the only people that you can bring with you is you've got the investor, and then the investor can bring in their spouse and any unmarried children under the age of 21. Okay. Spouses can get permission to work once they arrive in the United States. And the permission to work that the spouse gets allows him or her to work anywhere. In other words, the investor could only work for the restaurant. The spouse could work for the restaurant, or if the spouse, let's say, is an IT professional, they could go work and do something else because they might make more money doing that.
Sure.
Children will never get permission to work. They'll be able to go to school, but they'll never get permission to work. However, that doesn't prevent your family from volunteering.
Of course.
You're not paying them anything. They're just there, and that's okay. Now, as far as other family members, aunts, uncles, things like that, you can't bring them in unless you do something. Well, there's 2 things. A treaty investment only requires that the investor own 50%. Obviously, they can own more, but the minimum is 50%, which means that a single investment can accommodate 2 investors. So let's say this restaurant, which is worth $300,000, now you and I are brothers. We've each got our own family. So instead of me having to pony up $300,000, I'm only responsible for $150,000. You've got the other $150,000 covered, okay? So then we're both coming in, we're both bringing our families. And let's say we've got a third brother, and we have a way of bringing him in as a manager of the restaurant because he's the one that's had management experience back in Italy for the last 30 years. You and I have been doing something completely different. And that's something that's also very important. You don't have to have any prior experience with the type of business that you're investing in to get the investment visa. You can make the investment, which is the only thing that's required, and then you can hire other people to actually run that business for you. So you can be as involved as you want, or if you want to be out playing golf the whole time and have your third brother who's got the restaurant experience actually running it, we can bring him in a managerial or executive capacity with his own E2, and he brings his own family in with that.
That really plays right into the franchise model, doesn't it?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the Subway sandwich or
like I said,
or
love franchises.
McDonald's or anything like that really plays into that very well. So now we've got a pretty good summary of how the E2 works in relation to into a restaurant. Why don't you just give us a real quick summary of how that works? I mean, essentially, it's an investor visa. You can be as involved or as much or as little as you want. Really plays in well with the franchise. Family members, in terms of being paid, the kids cannot be paid. The spouse can have another job. There's no minimum investment, but realistically, you need to. You're gonna have to have more than $7,000 on most.
Well, it depends. Right. It really depends. I wouldn't want anybody listening to this to focus on how much they're going to have to spend, because it really depends on the business. So don't let that be your focus. And by the way, that was a great summary. Not really a whole lot for me to do.
Okay.
The only thing is, and this is sort of the key point with the investment. The key point and what an investor needs to focus on is what is the potential profitability of this investment within 5 years. That's really the key point, because if you have something that's got that profitability factor, and it doesn't need to make a lot of money, like I said, we're talking about minimal living income requirements, which I characterize as what I call hard living costs. This isn't what you're actually spending to live in the United States. This is what it's going to cost to put a roof over your head and to feed yourself and your family and pay utilities and gas. So, for example, I have clients who already own a home here, so they don't have a housing expense. Bottom line is, they may only need $1,000 or $2,000 a month for their minimal living costs, which means that that investment at the end of the day doesn't have to generate that much profit for it to work.
And just to close out, a little bit of a teaser. This really is not suitable for the European restaurant chain that wants to expand, like the Pret a Manger, the great sandwich shop that's in the UK, or some of the other chains that are going to be establishing over here. So why don't you just give a 15-second overview of what we're going to talk about next time.
Okay, next time we're going to talk about the L1A category, and it's multinational executives, and that's where somebody who owns a business overseas creates a U.S. subsidiary or affiliate, and by doing so is able to transfer executive or managerial personnel or personnel with specialized knowledge. And the big difference with that is that the L1A does have the ability to be converted to a green card at a certain point down the road.
Perfect. So
that'll be
hold that
that'll
thought,
be,
and we'll come back to
we'll
that.
have some fun with that.
With the next one.